introduction. You hear me okay at the back?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right, thanks. They told me the audio problems have been sorted, so pleased to get confirmation of that. I'm grateful to the Faraday for persisting in inviting me after for so long. So I must be doing something right, but I guess you will be the judges of that. I'm also grateful to Alistair for setting up the question about science and religion. Do we have to choose in such a helpful way? And also for getting the really tough questions off the table in the very first Q&A session. So I'm looking forward to a good run when the Q&A time comes around. So I'm going to talk about the religious origins of modern science, but I'll come back from time to time to this question about choices between science and religion and whether these are mutually exclusive options. So I've got 6 things I'm going to talk about here. The case for conflict between science and religion is what I'm going to start with. So I'm going to take the negative view that Alistair referred to about there being a perennial conflict between science and religion that characterises the present, but also can be traced back through history. And I'm going to look at a couple of key cases for conflict and suggest to you that they're more complicated than you often think. Then I'm going to move on to the positive case for ways in which religion has had a positive impact on the historical development of science. I'm going to talk on the second point about some of the ways in which science and religion interact or have interacted throughout history. And then I'm going to talk about a number of those last 4 motivations of scientists, the social and cultural sanctions that religion can provide for the sciences, the way in which religion can provide presuppositions that make scientific inquiry possible, and then I may say something about methods of investigation if we have time and if you're still open. So I guess I want to start with the case for conflict, and this is 2 key episodes in the history of science are thought to be emblematic of science and religion conflict. And very often when contemporary advocates of conflict between science and religion talk in historical terms, the 2 names that constantly arise are Galileo and Darwin. So I want to talk about these guys and get them off the table. But to give you an example of how these guys function historically, you probably know this person, but here is the line that is run. Religion is in a sense, he says. Science is just bad science. Don't fall for the argument that science and religion operate in independent spheres, he said. Religions have historically, his historical claim, always attempted to answer questions that properly belong to science. So if we're thinking about the question, do we have to choose between religion and science? Clearly, if this is your view, you do. Because science and religion are competing for the same explanatory territory. They always have, and they always will, but only one of these activities gives us the right answers, and that, of course, is science. So if we think back to the points that Alistair was making in the previous lecture, we have here a single dimension, and science and religion operate in that single dimension, and they attempt to provide explanations for precisely the same kinds of things. It's a zero-sum game, which is to say only one can be giving us the right kind of answer. And the argument is that it's always been like this, that science and religion have had this characteristic perennial battle. And therefore, when we see science and religion in the present, all we are seeing is a manifestation of this long historical battle, which is inevitable. Why? Because science and religion operate at the same level of explanation, and only one of them can be right. And this argument is duplicated in a number of the new atheists. And the key, as I say, the key historical exemplars of this conflict are Galileo and Darwin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at Galileo and Darwin very quickly, and then I'm going to move on to give you some examples of how science and religion have interacted positively. So let me talk about the Galileo affair. Here we have a 19th century depiction of Galileo, probably a reasonably accurate one in terms of the number of people who would likely be in the room. You'll often see depictions of Galileo facing a huge horde inquisitive, but it was more likely this kind of conversation. So here's the big picture for you. So let's have a think about what the Galileo affair was about, and I want to ask first of all whether it was a science and a religious conflict. Just to give you the background, Galileo was condemned by the Inquisition in 1633 for having taught and defended a new theory that the Earth was not at the centre of the universe, but rather the Sun was at the centre of the solar system and the Earth was a planet that rotated around the Sun. The hypothesis that Galileo was championing had actually been promulgated some 50 years before this by Nicholas Copernicus, and interestingly, of course, the Catholic Church wasn't particularly exercised by the publication of Copernicus's sun-centred hypothesis. Galileo, however, got into trouble. The timing, as we'll see, is a significant thing. But the important thing to understand is that what we have here is a competition between two models of the cosmos, or two models of what we now call the solar system. And so the debate was initially one between two scientific theories, and the question of evidence, which was has been the subject matter of a number of questions already in this conference, is an interesting one in relation to these competing models. Perhaps I should say there was a third model. There was a sun-centred model, which Galileo and Copernicus defended. There was an earth-centred model, which is a long-standing model called the Ptolemaic model. There was also a third model called the Tychonic model that had the Earth at the centre and the planets all revolved, the Sun going around the Earth, but the planets all going around the Sun. So it was a kind of compromise. What was interesting about these three models is that essentially they were empirically equivalent. That is to say, that they gave you more or less the same kinds of predictions. Okay, so here's the question. Given that you've got three competing models and they give you equal predictability, more or less, how do you choose between them? Because empirical evidence will not give you the answer to that question. Okay, empirical evidence is not going to be the way to decide. Now, one decision is to use, say, aesthetic variables. To say the Copernican model is simpler than the Ptolemaic model. And I should say the Ptolemaic model is a remarkably sophisticated mathematical model. It's a beautiful model. It had to be a beautiful and sophisticated model because, as we know, it's wrong, but the maths were beautiful and very sophisticated. The Copernican model was simpler. So simplicity gives us a way of choosing between the models, but it's got nothing to do with empirical fit. Okay? And as I say, the Tychonic model was also something that's going to give you, what you're interested in, predicting where the heavenly bodies are going to be. That's what we've got. The other thing we can say about the model that Galileo championed is that some of the evidence was against it. If the Earth was in motion, as the Copernican model, the model that Galileo was championing, was true, if the Earth was in motion, what we would expect to observe is that the stars, the positions of the stars would change slightly with respect to each other owing to parallax. Okay? Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. Take my word for it. If the Earth's in motion, the positions of the stars relative to each other should change slightly. That effect was not observed. It was not observed because the stars were much further away than people thought. But this goes back to the question again, the issue that Alistair raised in the first lecture, is that what counts as evidence depends on your theoretical framework that you're operating out. And the theoretical framework they were operating out of was that the stars were reasonably close. If the Earth was in motion, what would you expect to happen is that the positions would change with respect to each other. They didn't. There was observational evidence then against the motion of the Earth. Stellar parallax was only detected in the 19th century. So there was a considerable period before the relevant evidence was there to show that the Earth was in motion. Now, there are a number of other features that we could talk about, but the point I want to make here is that the scientific evidence in relation to these models was not decisive, and the scientific consensus at the time, interestingly, was on the side of the existing Ptolemaic model and not on the side of Galileo. The Church may not have had any right to be intruding into scientific affairs, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But it wasn't anti-science, in condemning Galileo, it was simply confirming the consensus of the time. Okay, so was it science and religion conflict? My suggestion is that there was competition between two, in fact there were three, competing scientific theories. There was also conflict between two conceptions of religious authority, and I won't go into this in any detail, but the answer to the question as to why Galileo got into trouble and Copernicus didn't is the Protestant Reformation. And Protestant Reformation is important background here because Protestants were claiming to interpret Scripture for themselves. The Catholic Church wanted to maintain that they had the right to interpret Scripture. What's that got to do with the Galileo affair? One of the things that got Galileo into trouble was a letter concerning the interpretation of Scripture that he circulated, and it seemed to the Catholic Church that Galileo was moving out of the sphere of astronomy and into the sphere of biblical interpretation. That was its turf, and that's why they came down heavily on Galileo. So it was partly about religious authority. There was also conflict within the Catholic establishment. It's important to understand Galileo had once been a friend of the Pope. He had considerable support within the institution. In this letter about biblical interpretation, people in Catholicism had been feeding him lines from the Church Father Augustine to help him strengthen his case. So there's internal battle going on within Catholicism itself. Okay, so that's the complicated thing. Was it science-religion conflict? I'm suggesting possibly not. Was this typical of the Catholic Church is the other question, and I'm going to just simply say no, it wasn't typical. My fonts have changed here, those no's should be somewhere else, but basically, was it science and religion conflict? No. Was it typical of Catholicism? No. In fact, Catholicism was the major supporter of astronomical research from the early Middle Ages till about the beginning of the 19th century. And historians estimate that no other institution supported the study of astronomy to the extent that the Catholic Church did. So all I want to suggest to you here is that although the Galileo affair is regarded as emblematic of how religion has treated scientists, this episode is much, much more complicated than we've often thought, and it's just not a straight-out example of science, religion, and conflict. And this, I say this without wanting to deny, certainly it's true that in 1633, the Catholic Inquisition condemned Galileo for vehement suspicion of heresy, and he had to retract his support for the theory. No doubt that that's the case. Is it an emblematic example of science-religion conflict? No, it's not. Okay, I'll just say something very quickly about Darwin. I'm not going to go into this in as much detail. There's much more at stake, I think, religiously or in terms of the Christian faith, with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Much more at stake religiously than there was in whether the Earth or the Sun was at the centre of the solar system. But let me just say this, if we think about the case of Darwin, we still have the same issue going on. There's a controversy within science itself. Whenever there is a new scientific theory, there will be resistance to it by those who have a stake in the existing theory. Okay? So there's going to be science-science conflict again, and there were scientists who didn't buy into the notion of evolution by natural selection. Many scientists bought into an idea of evolution. Many were sceptical about the mechanism of natural selection, and even Darwin's most avid supporter, Thomas Henry Huxley, never really thought natural selection was the mechanism. So we've got science v science conflict. That said, scientists jumped on board fairly quickly with evolution, if not evolution by natural selection. The other thing that we tend to forget is that Darwin had a significant number of religious supporters. Perhaps the most, the best known is the Presbyterian professor of botany at Harvard, Asa Gray, who was Darwin's chief PR guy in America. And the other interesting thing I think about the Darwin affair is that people like Thomas Henry Huxley used evolution by natural selection as a weapon to break, or to attempt to break, what he thought was an undesirable power of the Church of England in Victorian Britain. So Darwinism found itself used as a weapon an ideological weapon, if you like, to bring the sciences into much greater prominence socially than they had been. And I see there's a very interesting collection in the bookshop called, what's it called, Dallas? The book that you and I have a chapter in, Darwinism.
Oh yes, ideology and biology.
Ideology and biology. So if you're interested in how Darwinism has been appropriated for essentially non-scientific uses, have a look at the essays in that collection, which Dennis Alexander, who I see through the door, is about to make an appearance, edited. And Alistair and I both have chapters in that collection. In fact, it was a very congenial event here in Cambridge, putting that book together some years ago. Anyway, there he is. Trying to make a surreptitious entry. Okay, so where are we now? Look, historians have gone over these two episodes with a fine-tooth comb. I've given you a very quick sketch of why I don't think these two episodes of Galileo and Darwin are, in fact, the kind of emblematic instances of conflict they're often held out to be. Certainly there's something to them, but they're much more complicated than is otherwise thought. Now what I want to do is to turn to the positive side of the ledger and say, not merely are the two putative cases of conflict dodgy and not really supporting the overall conclusion, but if we look at the positive ways in which religion has impacted on the development of science, we get a completely different picture. And again, I'm just going to give you a few examples. But let's just think about some of the ways in which historically religion might have had, positively or negatively, an impact on the development of science. We often don't think about this, but and I borrowed these from John Brooke, who was the first Ygrios Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford. Scientists are motivated by different things. In the past, as we will see, a number of key scientists were motivated by religious concerns and religious convictions to be engaged in scientific activities. Social and cultural sanctions, I'll give you a better explanation of this, but here's the question, the basic question is, why is it that science has the prestige that it does in our society? And we tend to think there's a simple answer to that it delivers us stuff we want, technology and so on. That was not always the case. And so the interesting question for historians is why in the 17th century, modern science was getting underway in the West, why did it get backing? Why was it moved from a very peripheral activity to a central activity? And that's a distinctive feature, as I'll argue, of Western culture. What are the presuppositions that make science possible? And this goes back to, again, an example that Alistair gave us, that if you try and put God into the picture of a natural conception of the universe, you're going to end up with a God of gaps. But if you think of God rather as the canvas or the frame, that which makes possible the various activities, then we're going to talk here about religious presuppositions that play a role in making science possible. And these are going to go to things like the intelligibility of the world, or again, as Alistair referred to, the remarkable effectiveness of mathematics. Methods of investigation. We probably won't get round to that, so don't worry too much about that. I've got a fat book in the bookshop about that you can read. So let me, substantive content of science, I'm not even sure. We're not going to talk about all of these. I'm just remembering what I've put up on the slides. But theological or religious conceptions can actually form part of the content of science. Indeed, natural history in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in this country, overlapped substantially with natural theology. So the aim of the game, the reason we study nature, was to see evidence of God's designs in the natural world. So there's a substantial overlap between science and religion. And again, this is the point that Alistair's made, we've got these neat categories, science and religion. The boundaries of science and religion are very fuzzy. They were very fuzzy in the past. And an example of if science and religion have overlapping content, clearly that's not science as we now understand it. So even to ask the question of relations between science and religion in the past assumes something like a contemporary conception of science that itself distorts how we understand the past. And I've just given you an example about choosing between competing alternatives. Philosophers of science will say that very often we have models that are underdetermined by the data. That means we've got models that give us the same kind of predictability. Evidence won't enable us to choose between them. Sometimes religious preferences give us a reason to choose between models that we can't distinguish on empirical grounds. And in the contemporary situation, think multiverse versus universe, right? Why do atheist scientists tend to prefer a multiverse? Because it enables them to avoid some of the awkward anthropic implications, and Christian cosmologists may, not invariably, they may prefer the universe model because it might point in the direction of something like anthropic fine-tuning. Okay, so if you can't, there's no empirical grounds for choosing between these, but there might be extra scientific reasons why you might prefer one model to another. Going back to Galileo, some people wanted to interpret Scripture in a way that supported a geocentric, Earth-centered cosmos. So there are religious grounds for choosing between competing alternatives for which evidence, empirical evidence, doesn't provide sufficient ground. So all I want to say here is that the ways in which science can impact on religion historically, there are quite a number of them, and I'm just going to look at a few. I'm going to look at motivations, I'll talk about cultural sanctions, I'll talk about presuppositions. And the motivations one is dead easy. That is to say that in the early modern period, essentially the 17th century is when modern science kicked off and got running in the West. And the key figures were almost invariably committed Christians. Many of them argued that their religious beliefs were what motivated them to study the natural world. And Johannes Kepler, who came up with those beautiful 3 planetary laws that Newton subsequently subsumes into the inverse square law of gravitation, says this: I initially wanted to be a theologian, that's his vocational desire, but I now see that God is praised through my work in astronomy. So Kepler is going to use the notion that there are priests of nature, an expression we find in Robert Boyle and other people, that the study of the natural world is a priestly kind of activity. So there's a religious motivation for pursuing the study of nature. And here, Robert Boyle, the father of chemistry, a very significant advocate of an experimental approach to science. So, as he says, discovering unto others the perfections of God displayed in the creatures is a more acceptable act of religion than sacrificing or perfumes on altars. And he goes on to talk about the study of nature as being philosophical worship of God, or reasonable worship. This is the New Testament reference here. Reasonable worship of God is actually scientific activity. So, not merely do we have it's not as if we have a separation of science and religion. Science and religion are not opposed to each other. In fact, there's an overlap. The study of nature is actually something that's intrinsically religious for Robert Boyle, who, as you know, I'm going to say came up with the eponymous Boyle's gas law, but he didn't really. But that's the standard story. So let's not do that for now. P1 V1 equals P2 V2. Put temperature in as well if you like. Okay. Now, the big guy, Isaac Newton. We've got Rob Eiler's book out there, a very short introduction to Newton in the bookshop. But Newton, of course, wrote much more on religious and theological topics than he ever did on scientific topics. It's not necessarily widely known, but Newton, in the second edition of his classic work, The Principia, says that the most beautiful system that we see that's described in the Principia could only have come from the dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And Newtonian physics was often used to provide apologetic evidence for the existence of a wise and powerful God. So a series of, for those of you who know the Boyle Lectures, which have been recently restarted in London, the Boyle Lectures, a famous series of lectures started in the late 17th century to show how science gives evidence of the existence of God. The very first Boyle Lectures used Newtonian physics to argue for the fact of the Earth's being, the world's being evidence of divine design. So that's very simple. So scientists in the 17th century are religiously motivated. That's many of them. Okay, not all of them, and not all of them explicitly, but very simple point. Social and cultural sanctions. Now, this is a little bit harder to get your head around, but it's a really important aspect of how science gets to be where it is today. And the question we need to ask about this, that makes sense of this issue, is this. Why is it that science starts in a number of cultures, but only in the West does it consolidate? Right? So we can think about science in ancient Greece that doesn't consolidate, doesn't get up and running. We can think about medieval Islam, which has a very sophisticated scientific culture spread across Islamic society, but it doesn't consolidate, as it were. It's a boom-bust pattern that we see. We see remarkable technology, whether it's science and technology in China, but famously Voltaire says, we were still living in grass huts and the Chinese had, wheelbarrows and umbrellas and gunpowder and all kinds of stuff, right? But science doesn't take off in China. It doesn't move to the centre of the culture because the Chinese have different priorities. They don't prioritise science. So there's a question of value about what is it that a culture values, and Western culture comes to value science, and it's unique in doing that. Right? So the question then is, what are the values that underpin science that drive it from being peripheral to central? So we need to be clear on what the question here is. The question is not, are there brilliant scientists around to do scientific stuff? They're in every culture. Right? The question is, what leads a society to value those activities, right? and to essentially what we now see to fund them. So if you look around Cambridge University, 600 years ago, you had a few amateurs doing a bit of maths and so on here and there. Or look at the science faculties now, okay? For our humanities, they're really struggling. The boot was on the other foot for a very long time. How is it that change takes place? And it's not merely to do with the technological spin-offs that science provides, because they come later. And what I want to suggest to you is that part of the reason that science is valued in the West uniquely is that there are religious reasons for giving social legitimacy to the activities that constitute science. And I'm going to give you an example here. This is a famous thesis by a chap called Robert Merton. He's essentially a sociologist of science who, in the 30s and 40s of the last century, did an analysis of religious affiliations within the Royal Society. The Royal Society started in 1662 in London. Obviously, it's a very famous scientific organisation. What he found was that Puritans were disproportionately represented in the ranks of members of the Royal Society. So Robert Merton, as I say, the sociologist, a brilliant sociologist, he gave us such notions as unintended consequences and self-fulfilling prophecy. Those notions are Merton's. Argued that there was something about the Puritan ethos that gave people reason to value scientific activity. Now, subsequent analysis of Merton's work suggests that he didn't actually get the numbers right, and the category Puritan is problematic. But what Merton did was to ask the right question, and the right question is, why is it that people get behind science in the 17th century? And what he saw was that the reason they do is because of particular kinds of values, and that those values are embedded in particular religious traditions. How do you make the link? It's a complicated story about why there's religious valuing of scientific activity, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's Francis Bacon, who is a key figure in justifying why we should do a new experimental approach to science, and here is his religious justification for why we do science. He says, man fell, but so here's the story about Adam and Eve in the garden. They disobey God and they are cast out of the garden. That's the story of the fall. They fall away from their original perfection. So they fall from their state of innocence and they fall from their dominion over the created order. So in Genesis 1:28, there's this famous statement. God says to Adam, have dominion over all of the living things. And when they fall, when they disobey God, they lose that dominion. Animals become wild, you get all sorts of nasty plants and things. The earth itself falls away, and animals no longer obey Adam as they once had. So the dominion that Adam once enjoyed over the natural world, he loses as a consequence of sin. So Bacon says, here's the story. Both of these losses can be repaired. We can regain our lost innocence to some extent, and we do that through religion. But we can also regain the dominion over nature that we lost when we fell away from our original perfection. And the way we do that is through science. Okay? So why do we do science? Why is science important? Because, as Bacon argues, it's a way of re-establishing the originally perfect relation that we had with the natural world. So our dominion over nature is something that science gives us back. Our lost moral innocence is something that religion gives us back. And just to give you, so this argument runs in 17th century England, and here's some stats about, again, we can quibble with these stats. I wouldn't have done in a ditch for them, but they're significant. If you see, there's something quite distinctive about English religious culture at the time that seems to suggest a strong correlation between consolidation and valuing of scientific activity. Not a perfect correlation, because coming in number 2 spot are the French, right, Catholic country. But significantly, Spain's not even there at all. Okay, that's the major Catholic power at the time. So there's something to be said for these correlations between a particular set of Protestant Puritan religious values and the valuing of this argument about re-establishing dominion over the natural world. And just to sum it up, a quote from Stephen Gorproger, who's a colleague of mine in Sydney, University of Sydney. He's producing a 5-volume history of science in the West, or what he calls the emergence of a scientific culture. And here is his argument, which is essentially the same argument that I put to you. Good part of the distinctive success of science, the level of legitimation and consolidation. So it's not just having bright ideas scientifically, it's consolidating them in the culture and making them legitimate. It doesn't come from a separation of religion and science, as he says, natural philosophy. But that natural philosophy, that just means science in this context. Natural philosophy could be accommodated to projects in natural theology. So what historians of science tend to argue now is that there's a common view that says that science and religion get on really well in the Middle Ages, and that's really what held science back. And that when science breaks away from religion in the 17th century, it really takes off. And what historians of science, like Stephen Gorproger, who's an atheist, he has no interest in religious apologetics, but what historians are now arguing is actually the other way around, that in the Middle Ages, science and religion were quite separate. They occupy separate parts of the university curriculum, and those boundaries are very carefully policed. But in the 17th century, science and religion actually come together, and it's the coming together of science and religion that makes it legitimate, that gives it a central place in Western culture, uniquely, unlike any other place or any other time. And although the religious legitimation no longer is what sustains scientific activity, I would argue that technology is part of that story now. Originally, you want to know the story of why science uniquely arises in the West and assumes the proportions it does in terms of its importance. Religion is really an important part of that story. Okay. Moving on. Presuppositions. This is a relatively easy one. I'm just going to talk here about the notion of laws of nature. We tend to think that laws of nature are a given. Laws of nature as a concept appear on the scene historically in the 17th century. French philosopher René Descartes is the first person to talk about laws of nature. His English counterparts, like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, disagree with Descartes about lots of things, but the one thing they all agree on is that there are laws of nature, and what those laws of nature consist in are God actually controlling directly what's going on in the natural world and doing so in a lawful way. Now, clearly before this period, people had a sense of the intelligibility and order of the natural world, but that order was understood in terms of the internal properties of things. So things had particular natures, and those natures played out more or less, not invariably, but more or less in certain kinds of ways. That was the Aristotelian view, and the overarching model was that the world was like an organism, right? So it grew and developed in terms of its own internal principles. The overriding model from the 17th century is that of a machine, and a machine that is designed, and it's designed to work according to particular mathematical laws. This is a very distinctive feature of 17th century science, and it comes from the idea originally from Descartes, who says God imposes laws on things. That's why they run the way they are, and they don't have any inherent powers or capacities themselves. That was the old Aristotelian view. These guys are trying to do away with that. Now I had Johannes Kepler's wonderful, I wanted to do his three planetary laws for you, but I'm going to try and skip through that because, there we go. So just to give you some quick examples about, which is what I just said. Here's Descartes talking about this new idea that nature runs on laws, and it's an inherently theological conception, okay? And I know Barbara's going to be talking about laws of nature tomorrow, right? So
I also mentioned Kepler's laws.
Oh, good. So I won't have to. Kepler's laws are really quite stunning, but I'm very pleased that you'll talk about them and I can skip them. But here's the notion of what gets a law of nature up and running. God imparted various motions to the parts of matter when he first created them. He now preserves this matter in the same way by the same process that he originally created it. So it's a standard theological view that creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, and creatio continuo are essentially the same God's single creative act. But God is doing the work of moving things around in the natural world, and he does this in a lawful way, and that's what laws of nature are. Descartes' principles of philosophy. Here's Robert Boyle saying something similar. Laws of motion don't spring from the nature of things. They're not inherent in the world, but they depend on the will of the divine author of things. And this is the very notion of what a law is. So it's not a metaphor, it's a literal thing. This is a literal promulgation from God, directly influencing matter. And Samuel Clarke, who's a Newtonian theologian, who famously champions, there's a big squabble between Newton and Leibniz. It starts off with who invented calculus, and then it goes on to the state of natural theology and England being in great decay, says Leibniz. But anyway, Samuel Clarke comes to the defence of Newton, but here's Newton's view about laws of nature. The course of nature is nothing else but the arbitrary will and pleasure of God exerting itself and acting on matter continually. So if we want to know why does matter act according to mathematical laws, originally the idea is that it does so because that's the direct will of God operating on the natural world. And that, as I say, it's a new idea. It overtakes the Aristotelian idea about nature as an organism, nature as a machine. And that brings in a whole range of things, the possibility of having a mathematical explanation of nature, the possibility of mechanical explanations of nature, none of which were possible under the old Aristotelian model. Okay, you couldn't have a maths of nature, you couldn't have a mechanical understanding of nature. There's a long story that I could tell you about that, but I won't. But the general point here is the assumption, if it's the case that nature runs on laws of nature, there's a theological reason for thinking that that would be the case, at least in terms of the origin of the notion. Now, some contemporary philosophers of science don't think there are laws of nature. And again, Alistair mentioned one, Nancy Cartwright, but one of the reasons Nancy Cartwright, I think, doesn't think there are laws of nature is that she doesn't want to be committed to the theological presuppositions that would make the laws of nature work. Okay. So you don't have to be committed to laws of nature. I'm saying if you are, there might be an incipient or a hidden theological premise there. Now, let's wrap up laws of nature with Newton. Well, I should say Roger Coates is writing the preface to Newton's famous work, The Principia. The business of true philosophy, again, is to inquire after the laws of nature that God actually chose to frame this beautiful world, not those by which he might have done the same had he so pleased. He's having a go at Descartes there, but as I say, they both agree about there being laws of nature. But the point here is that we can't intuit what those laws of nature are. We have to go out and do the empirical work and discover them. So Descartes thought you could know the laws of nature by actually hypothesising what they might be, and Newton says, no, you've got to do experiments, and in doing lots of experiments you find out the mathematical structures that God has imposed on the natural world. Now, as I said, methods of investigation is something that you can read my book on. It's called The Forward Man, The Foundations of Science, because I won't, it's too complicated to go into at this late stage. But there's a nice picture of the fall. Let me come to the summary. I'll skip that as well. Okay. So, what can we say about the religious origins of modern science? First of all, I wanted to say, and it's not up here, that the historical episodes regarded as emblematic of science and religion conflict are much more complicated than we've often thought, and they don't unambiguously point to science and religion conflict, and they're certainly not typical of the relations between science and religion. So historically we can say, let's run with the notion that we've got concepts of science and religion that we can work with. They've interacted in a number of different ways, and I wouldn't deny that there are some instances where religious authorities have attempted to limit scientific expression, but that certainly is not typical, and that is far from the whole story. Science and religion conflict has been significantly exaggerated. And again, to allude to a point that Alistair made, the reason that Galileo and Darwin are so important is that they form part of a narrative that people have about science and religion conflict. And these historical stories are part of a way of framing a contemporary understanding of how science and religion should react. So the stories themselves have that power, and they're very hard to dislodge. But as I wanted to suggest here, they're stories that are false. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it's very clear to just about all historians of science that religious factors played a positive role in the emergence of science and, crucially, the persistence of science. Right? So what I wanted to say is what's distinctive about Western culture is not the emergence of scientific ideas, we see that in lots of places, it's the persistence and consolidation and legitimation of science. It's the real story there. And religion plays a key role in that. That's that next one. Science and religious values. So religious values give science legitimation. And the last one that we talked about was the fact that the presuppositions that make science possible are that the universe has a kind of mathematical intelligibility. That's not something that science invents, as it were. That's a presupposition that makes science possible. And again, my suggestion is that historically, this arises out of the notion of laws of nature understood in theological terms. All right, let me just go to further reading. And these are all in the bookshop except the last one. But Hilary tells me it's too complicated for you guys. No, it's all right. But in a sense that you can't see the title, but the territories of science and religion is really about what I think is a really crucial question when we ask, do we have to choose? Because if we're choosing between science and religion, we're assuming that they must be occupying the same kind of territory. And this is really a book, this last one here, I'll come back to it, is really a book about how the boundaries of science and religion have emerged over time, and how we conceptualise those boundaries is really crucial to this question about whether they're mutually exclusive alternatives, which is, as you know, the theme of our meeting. But the second, well, let me go right. Science and religion, a very short introduction. It's a terrific introduction to a range of issues in science and religion, but I'll put it up there because it's historically very sophisticated as well. So there's a lot of history in it. Galileo goes to jail, and other myths in the history of science and religion will take apart the Galileo story and the Darwin story. There's lots of other narratives there as well that book demythologises, and that's in both of those are in the bookshop. And the Cambridge Companion to Science and Religion just does a number of different things, but it's got a historical section. There are 4 or 5 chapters on that. So, let me finish there and we'll go to Q&A. Thanks.
Let me start with a plug for my home team. The idea that science is supportive of religion was proposed in the 12th century by Maimonides. He has in his book about commandments. There's a commandment: one should love God, and he says, how does one go about doing it? By studying the natural world and seeing God's, quote, wisdom, which has no end, and therefore one comes to love God. So this is a theme also in Judaism. Now, I was sort of unhappy about your discussion about Galileo and Darwin. With Galileo, the idea that it's true that when there was Copernicus's theory about the heliocentric solar system was no more accurate than the geocentric theory, but the geocentric theory had over 100 parameters called epicycles. Each epicycle puts in 2 parameters. So if you put over 100 parameters in, you can explain anything. And the reason that Copernicus wasn't any better because he still assumed circular motion at a constant speed. But when Kepler in 1609 said, well, let's try ellipsis and not at a constant speed, it fit perfectly. So by the time Galileo came out in 1633, there was a clear reason to prefer, scientific reason to prefer the Kepler-Copernicus idea over the heliocentric, but the church didn't accept it. And why wasn't there a trial about Copernicus? Because he said, I don't know what's going on up there. The church, only the church decides what's. I have a formula. If you take my formula, you can explain what how the planets are.
So can you say what your question is, Peter?
Oh, I was going to make a comment. Are you allowed to make comments? This finishes Galileo. I'd like to make a brief comment about Darwin. 2 sentences. The reason Darwin wasn't accepted at the beginning because nobody knew about genetics. It wasn't until genetics came, and therefore everybody, all scientists except the Darwin and the theologians, the religious leaders, including in my religion, to this day, they're opposed to Darwin on religious grounds. So I think this is a conflict of religion.
Yeah, okay, let me, I think this is on, yeah, the red light showing. Let me work backwards. Yeah, look, of course there are controversies over evolution and creationism. No one would deny that. Interestingly though, I think historically, the contemporary controversies about creation do not date back to the 19th century. They begin in the early 20th century, so there's no continuity. And my point is that initially in the context, whatever discussions there are about Darwin, they don't map onto contemporary conflicts, which I'm not denying at all happen. But my point is, what we should not do is to extrapolate back from contemporary controversies between young Earth creationists and Darwinian scientists back into history. That's the mistake, right? So that's the Darwin thing. Going back to Galileo, no, I'm sorry, Galileo does not accept, elliptical orbits. He has a theory of the tides that's crazily wrong, but insists, in fact, his original book was going to be a theory of the tides, and he was persuaded to change the title because he had a theory that the tides show that the Earth's in motion. Completely wrong, because there are 2 tides a day. Everyone knew it was wrong. Okay, so to say that there's a scientific consensus is not in favour of Galileo. It's just completely false to say that. In the fullness of time, yes, of course we come to an understanding. Yeah, all these things fall into place. As for Darwin, in the neo-Darwinian synthesis, once we understand genetics, we can make natural selection get off the ground. But the point I would make here is that for people who are contemporary to when these new theories arrive on the scene, the question of whether you choose to opt for the new theory is a very, very difficult one, And we should not conflate the ease at which you should accept the new theory with the sort of hindsight we now have about how evidence subsequently accumulates in favour of a particular theory. And the neo-Darwinian synthesis is a classic case of that, just as Kepler and Newton are classic cases of how Galileo, in retrospect, seems entirely justified. But again, until you've got Newtonian physics, it's impossible to make a Galilean system work. You don't have the physics to make it operate. As likewise, without Kepler's elliptical orbits, you can't make it work. So the idea that somehow that it was obvious that Galileo was right, I'm sorry, it's just wrong. Was there any problem? Maimonides, yeah, absolutely. Of course, the Hebrew Bible has a number of references to the fact that we see evidence of the wisdom of God in creation. So there's a long-standing tradition about that. But that's a rather different thing, I think, from relations between science and religion. But again, it's because our concepts of science and religion are relatively modern that argument starts to get fuzzy once you go beyond the 19th century anyway.
Hi, I'm interested a little bit in the transition from the Aristotelian view to the mechanical view, and I'm wondering if in this age where we're dealing with things, and I'm going to throw in some big words that we'll start to understand, like unknowability, quantum indeterminacy, are we moving maybe into a third place that's beyond the mechanical view? And how does this challenge the persistence of science as having a privileged place in our society? Does that connect to some of the narrative and meta-narrative that Professor McGrath discussed?
Okay, yeah. Look, the one about the mechanical worldview I think is very interesting because the mechanical worldview, but in some areas doesn't even survive to the end of the 18th century in a strong way, because the mechanical world, it's very hard to subsume biological processes, and particularly the problem of the issue of generation, which is say reproduction. How do you account for reproduction in mechanical terms? Was a real problem for so while the mechanical worldview seemed to work well for physics, it was much more difficult in what we would now call biology. Now, it wasn't such a problem then because natural philosophy and natural history were distinct enterprises, and the mechanical worldview operated in the natural philosophical realm, and natural history was something else. But your point about, in a quantum world, clearly it's not mechanical, although intuitions attempt to make it mechanical, and neither, interestingly, is it materialist in any strong way, I think. So there's a sense in which in modern physics, yes, we've transcended all of that mechanical stuff and the sorts of theological assumptions about laws of nature and a mechanical worldview, they have to be reworked, okay? I should say that the stories about the original religious legitimation of science, the question I think that remains are, to what extent are these still at some level operating, or has science now got a whole different way of gaining legitimation? Or does it still need something like religious values to underpin it? And that's a question for the future, I guess. But to go back to your question about quantum mechanics, absolutely. So the mechanical worldview, it had a limited lifespan. It lasted a lot longer in physics than in biology, but quantum mechanics put the kibosh on that eventually.
Thanks. Another question at the back there, Colin.
Hi, sorry, thank you very much for your talk. I was going to ask a very similar question to the one that you've just posed, as to the fact that, okay, religion legitimised and centralised science, but does science, A, still need it, or B, is it actually helpful, or is it even detrimental to science today? And just on the quantum thing, and the mechanical worldview, is it necessary actually for the mechanical worldview to break down just so that free will in itself is still a valid thing to talk about?
That's all right. I think this one seems to be working. Yes, yes. So, right, going. Let me work backwards. Free will. Yeah, I don't want to touch that. Have you got someone talking about free will later in the week?
Thursday we have a lecture on free will.
Save it for Thursday. Look, quantum mechanics doesn't help us with that. I don't. Quantum mechanics doesn't help with that. The interesting question, I think, is about whether the universe is fully deterministic and whether a mechanical worldview of the 17th century thinkers required that kind of mechanistic view. But again, it goes back to the question. I said the key problem for mechanical worldview was biological generation. But the question of the mind, of course, is another. Descartes solves this famously through something like separating out the realm of the mind from the material realm, so that you've got the mechanical laws operating there, but you've got something else going on here. You do nonetheless have some sort of lawful relations, I think, and this is often misunderstood for Descartes. People think Descartes has a problem relating the spiritual stuff of mind to the mechanical stuff of matter. He doesn't. What's implicit, I think, in the Cartesian system is that just as laws of nature, matter causation is as problematic as mind-matter causation. All causation becomes problematic in the 17th century, and they tend to talk that the whole law talk is a way around that. Aristotle talked about causes. 17th century talks about laws, and what laws is about is description of regularities, so that how material things interact causally is stepped back from, and there's talk instead of description in mathematical laws that avoids the question of causation completely. So Newton famously can't really give an account of how gravity operates. He can describe in mathematical laws what happens. Now, this is a long way around. Again, back to Descartes and mind and matter. In essence, what Descartes would suggest is that the way the mind operates on matter is not to be understood in terms of causal relations, but can be described in terms of psychical material laws. So he doesn't say this, but this is the solution to the Cartesian problem. So what we know is that our minds control our bodies, and there's a regularity to that. How that happens is not any more problematic than how matter-matter interaction takes place. So now, we're supposed to be talking about free will, weren't we? Yeah, I still think keep it till Thursday. But part of the solution is to say that the realm of mind is different from the realm of material things in which these laws operate. And really, in a sense, that's a kind of explanation that goes right through to Kant. There are, radical French materialists who want to materialise the mind and say it's all deterministic. But it's an enduring problem. Was there something about what was the first part of your question? I'm sorry.
The legitimacy of science.
Today,
whether it's.
Yeah, so look, this is an interesting question to me. It seems to me that science has lost some of its lustre, and it's lost some of its lustre because people question whether the roles science plays in some of the bad things that are going on. We know there's some obvious examples of that, but the general question about industrialisation, the deterioration of the environment, and the implication of science in all of that. So it's not the case that science reigns preeminent. People have doubts and worries about it, and these questions go back to that question of what is it that makes science legitimate, and whether the things that science delivers to us in terms of technology and knowledge outweigh what seem to be the misapplications of science and the problems that it generates. But I don't think, certainly religion is not explicitly part of that conversation anymore, although when you come to talk about environmental questions, it seems to me that this is really a space where religion can once again operate as something that talks about what it is that's legitimate to do. And I know Faraday has been involved in a number of those, in exploring those sorts of questions, but most interestingly, recently, obviously, the Pope's encyclical about, religion and the environment, where he's attempting to, as a Franciscan, to once again invoke values about religious values that will, operate in some normative way on culture generally, but that would include science.
More questions? Yeah, well.
I would like to come back to the laws of nature. So you mentioned that the idea of law originated in the belief that there is God as a lawgiver. And you also mentioned that nowadays often philosophers of science reject this idea. And that's also something that I notice when I read philosophy of science and philosophy of physics. These people always discuss the question, why are there laws, if they accept the existence of laws? And then they rule out from the beginning the concept that God is the origin of the laws. They just don't, they behave as if this option was not reasonable today. So I'm always surprised at the way how they handle this question. And I mean, my view is still today, theism is the best philosophical foundation of why nature obeys mathematical laws and so on. So can you comment on why philosophy of science nowadays just universally rejects the idea that God would be a legitimate foundation for laws of nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do simply because of the operation of methodological naturalism, not merely in the sciences, but across all of the university disciplines. So, even if there's an acknowledgement of the fact that historically laws of nature as a notion come into existence from theological reasons, and often that's not even known or acknowledged, the idea that the coherence of the notion of laws of nature might be in some way dependent on theological premises is problematic. And I mean, I understand why it's problematic, because I think as a historian I wouldn't want to invoke providential explanations of this is a hot topic issue in history, I have to say, but I don't think in any university discipline you can use theistic explanation in that way. You certainly can't in the sciences, obviously, and rightly so. So there's a principle of methodological naturalism that operates in the sciences. So I guess the explanation to the answer to the question is that philosophers invoke that and historians invoke it too. Now, I think it's a lot trickier in history. It's not so tricky in philosophy, and obviously in science it's how things are done. But as I say, there's a very interesting question about history and whether, yeah, no, I won't go into that. So, but I do think that it's a little bit like, to go back to Nancy Cartwright example, just so that you know, Nancy Cartwright is a very eminent philosopher of science who has said there aren't any laws of nature, and in fact that the regularities that we see in the world are not all connected up in some neat way, so that there's no overarching, you know, big theoretical framework that
Theory of everything.
there's not a theory of everything that you can ultimately reduce all of the different kinds of regularities to. So it's a very interesting claim. Certainly she's right in terms of the existing state of the sciences, but what she wants to suggest is that these little patterns of regularity that we see as functions of, they're not functions of our epistemic limitations, that is to say, they're not functions of the limitations of our capacity to drill down to the real things that are going on. What she wants to say is when we drill down to really what's going on, we're still going to have a pattern of different kinds of special sciences that can't be unified in any strong way. Now, I suspect that part of what motivates that is the desire to avoid the theistic implications of it and the notion of overarching laws of nature and design. But I've pressed Nancy on this and she's not been overly forthcoming, although Lydia, what's Lydia's last name? Lydia Jaeger, I think, has spoken directly to her about this and she's fessed up. So,
Well, wasn't it Nancy Cartwright who said you can't have laws without a lawgiver?
yes.
Yeah, so it's a presupposition that there is no lawgiver, therefore I'm not going to have laws. I mean, she said that explicitly.
Yes, no, she has said that explicitly.
Another way to investigate this historically would be to look at the Muslim development of their astronomy. You put a little diagram up there about Muslim astronomers were making observations at the same time that Galileo was. But they did not, well, I've read that Muslims, astronomers did speculate on the heliocentric model, but it didn't develop in the same way. And I wonder if I've read suppositions or speculations that it was the Muslim idea of God as an inscrutable, not lawgiver, but maker of the cosmos. And I wonder if you have any comments on how the Muslim development of astronomy was connected to their theology.
Yeah, look, it's a very interesting question, and there's a lot of work being done on this, and I have to say I'm not an expert on it, but it's pretty clear that in the development of Copernican theories, Islamic astronomy played a very significant role, and it's a role it's broadly acknowledged now by historians and astronomers. So there's no doubt about the significance of the Muslim influence on the development of Copernican theory. I think the other really interesting thing about, you'll often hear it said that what killed off Islamic science was Al-Ghazali's God is completely inscrutable, and the combination of this theological voluntarism where the world is dependent on the will of God that's inscrutable to us, and that's combined with, interestingly, an atomic matter theory. So we're talking about the Mutakallim. This is a branch of Islamic thought, which is regarded as hostile to science, and partly because it's hostile to Aristotelianism. And what's interesting about this story is that precisely this combination of God as inscrutable and in combination with an atomic matter theory that happens in the 17th century West, where again it's hostile to Aristotelian science, but actually forms the bedrock of contemporary modern science, because it's the inscrutability. It's precisely what Newton said here. We don't know what God has chosen. We do know he's incredibly powerful, and the laws of nature are a direct function of his will. This was precisely what was being said by these voluntarist Islamic theologians who were regarded as virulently anti-science. But it provides the basis for an empirical investigation of the natural world to determine what choices God has actually made when he instantiates a particular order. He could have instantiated any number of orders. So that motivates empirical investigation. So the very things for which Islamic theology is condemned in the 9th and 10th centuries, an emphasis on the sovereignty of God in combination with an atomic matter theory, it's precisely that combination in Newton that brings about a significant change in the science of the West. That's my take on it, at any rate.
But why did Muslim science not take off? There were other social complications.
Well, look, see, there's a whole. It's a complicated story, because what I've tried to suggest is that it's part of the Baconian view about science playing a particular redemptive role that gives it the religious legs that it doesn't have in medieval Islam. And that's only a small part of the story. The other aspect of it is that there's a whole institutional story. So there are no universities. We don't have the equivalent of universities in Islam, in Arabic cultures. And there's also what's happening to what's happening in the political scene. That people get distracted from science if things are happening to the empire. And so there are layers and layers in the story. So historically, everything is always overdetermined. In science, it's often underdetermined. In history, it's often overdetermined. And I've told you a slice of that story about how religious values legitimate science in a way that didn't happen in other places. But there are lots of variables involved in why science doesn't get up and running. And it's not just to do with sets of ideas. There are all sorts of material conditions and political circumstances that are also going to mean that science doesn't flourish in some places and it does flourish in others.
Okay, we'll have one last question, because you've had your hand up for a long time.
Right. My question's about 21st century neuroscience of mind. You've got 100 billion neurons. They're processing language with synapses, each one I don't know, guess 120 chemicals or more doing that. So you can process the language you like from any religion. It's your whole lifetime knowledge is in your brain and everything that's going on. That's where we get our feelings of transcendence from. So I just wondered if we're going to actually bring religions together and science and everything by actually understanding the mind and all these chemicals. It's too complex, of course, can't really understand, but is that where we're going to be able to bring everything together?
Okay, so we come back to the question of religious pluralism, which is not a topic. I mean, Alistair, did you pump this one, Alistair? You answered. No one's talking about religious pluralism later in the week, are they? Yeah. No. Look, let me say something general about the religious pluralism issue, which has been raised already in the first session, which is to say there are lots of different religions. So to talk about science and religion is itself already problematic, because it's not clear that there is a thing, religion, that's got a lot of significant common elements. And partly for that reason, I don't think anything that happens in the neuroscience is really going to help us there, because the issue is not how do we bring the religion, for me at any rate, right? The issue is not how do we bring the religions together, etc., etc. The issue is how do we ever end up with a concept of religion that embraces all of these different things which are totally disparate, and that can't be brought together, because really the very concept of religion is a Western way of attempting to make order out of, a sense of order out of various other, the way other cultures operate, an attempt to map other cultural practices onto a Western understanding of religion. Now that's a subject for a whole other lecture, but the point here is that it's not a problem to be solved by any even, I mean, I'm deeply sceptical that the neurosciences would ever get to that kind of level anyway, but even if they could, it's not a problem they can solve, because it's a pseudo problem that's generated by the fact that we've got a concept of religion that draws, that makes a lot of things look the same that aren't really the same at all. Okay? So it's an impossible problem to solve in that sense, I think, but that's a personal take.
Well, thank you, Peter. We do have a neuroscience talk, I think, later on, don't we? Let's thank Peter again.